last lecture. Today we're going to be talking about chapter 24, which hopefully you've read, the digital revolution and beyond. So we're basically going to be talking about the 1980s up to today, or about 5-10 years ago. So during the last quarter of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, a lot of electronic and computer technology started to advance at an extraordinary pace. This really transformed every means of human interactivity. How we communicated, how we looked at things, how we processed things, how we designed things. Graphic design was really changed forever during this time because of digital hardwares, digital software, and kind of the explosive growth of the internet. By the 1990s, digital technology enabled one single person on a desktop computer to control really every function of design. We talked about back in the day when we talked about illustrated manuscripts that there would have to be the scriptorium. The secretary would be in there, the copisti would be in there, the illuminator would be in there. All these people would be working to create one single book. Now, because of digital technology, all of these things could be done by one designer. There was no need for separate rules anymore. In spite of a kind of strong resistance at the beginning of the introduction, technology really began to improve and be accepted widely and extremely rapidly. During this time also, there was a growth in cable television, satellite television, and what that did was really expand the number of broadcast channels that people were intaking. So before we looked at a lot of magazines started to print bigger and wider and more magazines. So this same expansion was happening with digital technology. Cable and satellite was coming onto the scene in television. So that kind of started to pave the way for motion graphics. Now design was no longer about a printed piece. It was about how it moved, how it felt, what the illustration looked like, and how it performed within a space and within the context of this new technology of television. So the rapid development of the internet was happening at the time as well. During the 1990s, the internet obviously was being invented, and it changed the way that people communicate. By the early 21st century, and especially today, a lot of people have become dependent on the internet for information and entertainment. Before, they had to go to a newspaper, they had to hear from word of mouth, they had to look at some kind of piece that a designer or artist had created to find out the context of what was happening around the world. Now we have Twitter, where we can find out in 3 seconds if there's something happening across the world in another hemisphere even. So, because of these advances in technology, graphic experimentation really opened up. There wasn't a distinct style after this time, and in the postmodern world, it's really all about what you can do. The limitations have been blown kind of wide open, and yes, there are trends that happen, but there's not one kind of unifying style because the digital revolution really opened us up to explore any style that we want. It's really created a kind of pluralism in design, which means that it's not one thing happening, and it's many things happening all together at the same time. So the digital revolution started to come to the desktop of individual designers as a result of an affordable hardware and software. So in the 1980s, Macintosh, or Apple, introduced the first Macintosh computer. It was the first personal computer. And with this, Adobe introduced the PostScript programming language. So Apple's first computer was introduced in 1984, and the Macintosh used bitmap graphics. Basically what that means is there's a small grid of pixels, much like we lay out type on. We have a small grid of little squares. Now, bitmap means that these squares are either on, which means that they're black, or they're off, which means that they're white. So they're either positive space or negative space. There's nowhere in between of grayscale, and there's nowhere in between of color. It is either on or off. So bitmap, often you'll see, will have jagged right edges and look like tiny little squares that are arranged because there's no transition from light to dark. It's either light or it's dark. The original screens were at 72 dpi, which means that there were 72 dots, or these pixels, per inch. Apple released software for word processing along with some basic fonts. The original fonts that were designed for Apple Computer, you'll need to know this for your quiz, were designed by a designer by the name of Susan Kate. Susan Kate, K-A-T-E. Now, we had some problems with bitmap graphics. As you can see, bitmap fonts that are on your screen right now look digital. They have little squares. You can tell that it looks a little bit off, that it has something that's not done by a human. So Apple started to introduce this PostScript language that allowed printers to output many different elements and different placements on a page. Now, PostScript is notable because it didn't just include bitmap fonts like we're looking at here. It would include kind of data. It wasn't saying if it was on or off. It would use mathematical coordinations to create smooth curves. This PostScript language is known for creating kind of curved lines for the first time in type in the digital setting. These curves are called Bezier points, and they are named after a mathematician by the name of Bezier. And how you spell Bezier is B-E-I-Z-E-R. Bezier. A lot of people say Bezier points, but it's Bezier points. So a Bezier point, as you see on here, is anything that is noted with a little C on this graph. Any of those little dots that are coming out are Bezier points. What a Bezier point is it basically says we're going to start this here, and the next place that this line needs to go is here. And between those two, it will show that it is curved or it would be straight. So a Bezier point or a Bezier curve is basically a mathematical algorithm. So instead of saying that the pixel is either on or off, the math is saying, okay, we start at point A and we get to point B, and through complicated math, it is going to have a arc that is 30 degrees or whatever it is. And that's how Bezier points work. And I'll post a YouTube video to kind of explain that a little bit more so that you can understand when you're working in Illustrator how a Bezier point really, really works. So Apple introduced this and it revolutionized type. Now they could create type that was as precise and as distinct as the types that they had been working with woodblock printing, with copperplate engraving, with really any other kinds of printing they were working with. So in 1985, eventually, Apple introduced the first printer that would print at 300 dpi. So it's 300 dots per inch, and that's what we print at today. And that's what creates a really clear image that is viable in a real-world printed setting. What this did is this allowed for fonts to be more closely duplicated and to be typeset in perfection. You could do absolute tiny little details. Individual letters could be moved within like 1/100th of an inch. So by 1990, the Macintosh 2 computer was released and it was color capable. A lot of improved software had started to spur on technological advancements, and it created a shift from hand-lettered manuscript books that were in kind of that Gutenberg style to this fully digital printed book. They didn't want things to look like they were printed with movable type, with a printing press, or printed with woodblock printing. They wanted it to all be digital. So the number of individual design firms that were producing fine work started to rise exponentially because of the digital revolution. On the other hand, the digital revolution made this technology accessible to the everyday man, to the commoner. And this resulted in a lot of digital technology coming out from untrained and marginally trained practitioners, kind of just tossing things out. So people that didn't know how to design were kind of just designing using digital means because they could now. So using a computer was a completely new workflow for some designers because it enabled you to correct mistakes. Before, if you had a mistake, you were done. You had to restart, you had to crumple it up, you had to somehow paint over and hide your error, but now you could fix your mistakes. Also, things like color, textured images, typography could be stretched. It could be bent. It could be kind of made transparent. Things could be layered. And all these different elements could be combined in new ways that had never been available before. A designer by the name of Rudy Vanderlans, and that's Vanderlans, Rudy Vanderlans, began to edit and design in 1984 and started to publish this magazine called Emigre. So Emigre used an experimental approach, much like Versacrum, and it really defined and started to demonstrate the capabilities of this new technology that was on the scene. But it wasn't wildly popular because it actually proved to be too experimental for a lot of design publications, a lot of designers. They didn't understand it, and it was almost scary to see what this new technology could be doing. So in 1987, Vanderlans left his design job working at Emigre, and he was dissatisfied with the limited font choices that were available on the early Macintosh. So he started to work and figure out a way to create new typefaces. And he created this software called Font Editor, which we can still use today, to create his own digital typefaces. And we'll come back to some of those a little bit later in the lecture. So the next designer we're going to talk about is Mr. David Carson. David Carson is one of the big names, especially of our generation. He started working in the 1990s when computer processing really started to accelerate progress, and a lot of designers started to work and accept this idea of working digitally. Adobe Photoshop was introduced during this time, and it was developed as an electronic photographic retouching program. So strictly for retouching photographs in the beginning, but it also enabled an unprecedented image manipulation means that you could use outside of just retouching photos. One of the front runners with this experimentation of digital technology during this time in the 90s was David Carson. So he started out as a surfer and a school teacher, right? So he's just like the cool dude. And he turned to design in the 1980s. Carson really got rid of grids, got rid of consistent layouts, didn't want patterns, and really wanted to explore the possibilities. And David Carson was the embodiment of that idea that I talk about all the time, that creative problems call for creative solutions. He took this so to an extreme that every single page that he would design would be a creative problem that he'd have to solve in a creative solution way. Yes, he had a visual style that was identifiable that we'll talk about in a second, but he was addressing each page as its own kind of beast to tackle. So David Carson is known for having kind of revolutionary layouts, and some visual identifiers are that his page numbers would sometimes be set in the largest type on the page. A lot of times he would have a small picture that would be captioned, or things would become enlarged, kind of disjointed. He was very, very intentional at making things look almost abstract. He wanted each letter and each little thing that he did to become a design element, not just be type that's on a kind of grid. So this is some work of David Carson. You have some work of Keith Haring there in the background on that photo. But this is the work of David Carson. It's very, very paying a little bit homage back to the International Typographic style. But as you can see, it's somehow bringing it into a new world. It's bold. It's different. It's creating these design elements that you have to kind of piece together. If you look at it, you're trying to think of, what does it say? There's just letters. It's kind of large letters. As you start to look, you see it says hanging at Carmine Street. You flip it upside down. Again, it says hanging at Carmine Street. And he really wanted to use these layouts to create a new visual look. And so this is very, very stereotypical of the David Carson look. He became extremely controversial using this style in the 1990s. And a lot of people were angered that he was crossing the line between order and chaos. As we said, he was paying homage back to the international typographic style, but somehow making that chaotic. Designers weren't really okay with that. They were confused. It was too different. It was too out there. So during... eventually he got hired and started working at Ray Gun Magazine. At Ray Gun Magazine, he kind of prepared and opened a forum for illustrators and photographers to contribute to the magazine and really experiment with what they could do with design. He eventually left Ray Gun in 1996 and started working for larger companies like Coke and Nike. But you can see some more of his work here. Notice, again, David Carson, that it's very disjointed, almost abstract, but somehow still readable, somehow still interesting. The page layouts don't really matter. You see these odd shapes, the weird orientation of how the type is set on this page. Another great example of David Carson. It's almost in the style of Dada or that Words and Freedom, but it's a combination of international typographic style and Dada and a little bit of that Words and Freedom style. So the next designer we're going to talk about is Fred Woodward. So in 1987, Fred Woodward became the art director of Rolling Stone magazine, and his partner there was Gail Anderson. What's notable about them is that they worked extremely well with type. They would match typefaces and images to the content. So again, creative problem, creative solution. Each time, they would have to match a typeface to whatever image was being presented. Woodward would work closely with unique typography. The visual identifier for them is that they would work with audaciously large typography. So Fred Woodward and Gail Anderson, especially working at Rolling Stone magazine, they're known for having this audacious, huge type that they would put on layouts. Although the magazine started to convert to digital means in the 90s, Woodward started to switch away from the digital revolution. He wanted his publication to have a handmade quality, and so they would use a lot of lettering that was found type, hand lettering, or really lettering that had been aged and run through a copier many, many times to create a kind of new and bold look. This is some stereotypical work from Rolling Stone magazine. As you can see, giant type. This was a 3-page spread using just the photo of Sinead O'Connor and this giant type with the O that kind of spanned this spread. Some more work of theirs. Desktop computers really enable designers to make and market their own typefaces. So during this time, a virtual explosion of new typefaces started to occur. As you can see here, again, that Fred Woodward working with very, very large type. A lot of times working with bold colors, almost paying homage here back to the digital style. Talking to the limited color palette, using the black and white on kind of a rectangular grid, but still staying true to what they were, which was using that broken wood type, using type that had kind of been forgotten at the time and brought back into this new style of large type and really working in a postmodern world. During this time of kind of typeface expansion, Adobe really started to become an influential and important digital type foundry. Before they were making just things that designers could use to create things, but now they started to move into the type foundry zone. In 1987, this type family was released, designed by Summer Stone, and it is named Stone. Yes, she named it after herself. It's one of the earliest typefaces to be developed in the PostScript language. What that means, again, is that it wasn't bitmap. It wasn't full of pixels saying that this pixel is either on or off. It was made of those Bezier points, meaning that it's mathematical algorithms showing you what this letter should look like and what curves are connected to what points. So it was designed by Summer Stone, one of the first typeface families to be released in the PostScript programming language. In the past, a lot of designers would have to take the machine into account when creating type. They would have to think if they're working on a Gutenberg press, if they're working on a linotype, how are we going to get the matrices for the linotype? How are we going to get wood type that is set at 56 point to be on this poster? So now, type designers didn't have to worry about that. Their typeface could be used in a million different ways, and any kind of orientation, any kind of way that they wanted to use it, because of things like the inkjet printer that were kind of coming alongside the digital revolution to bring it into a real printed world. We're talking about a couple type designers now that were working during this time. Again, this was a time of extreme type explosion. So I'm going to give you some typefaces, some that we use today, some that aren't so popular, and give you kind of the story and history behind them. So the first one we're going to talk about is this set of 3 typefaces. Now, they were made by some of the staff of the designers at Adobe. 2 of the people that worked on these were Carol Twombly, 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 Carol Twombly, and Robert Slimbach, and that's Slimbach, Robert Slimbach. So these 2 kind of emerged as the outstanding staff for typeface design at Adobe during the time. Twombly created these 3 typefaces that are known for their real historical style. Charlemagne, Lithos, and Trajan. Lithos being kind of a ancient Greek, Trajan really being that Roman serif that we see with the varying line weights, with the real chiseled kind of cuneiform serifs happening on the ends. And Trajan, if you don't know, is known as the movie poster font. Trajan is very, very bold, very strong, and it's viewed that way because it has such deep roots in the styles of kind of that traditional Roman serif, that it was chiseled into rock. It was very, very strong, but it's an update to that so that it's much more readable, much more bold, and has much more style. A kind of jamming together of the modernist movement when we're looking at typefaces like Bodoni, and the very, very old kind of traditional type movement when we're looking at things like traditional Roman type. So Slimbach, the other person working in Adobe, was a creator of, he was a master calligrapher actually, and really started to create these typefaces in different styles. He created these typefaces that you'll see here. Adobe Garamond, Myriad, Minion, Catfish Script, Poetica, Adobe Jensen, Kronos. So he was much more of a traditional typographer. He really wanted to look back at those times that we talked about, the time of William Castellan, and really the expansion of that typographic genius that was happening during that time, and bring it into a new modern setting. Take some of those forms into a sans serif, refine those that were serif, and make them in a digital form so that they could be used within the digital revolution. Now, in the 1990s, access to typography increased, and because of that, there was the return of novelty typography. Now, if you remember, during the expansion of wood type, when people were just creating all kinds of wood type, we saw that it got really out of control. They were putting shadows on shadows, they were putting crosshatch shadows with a picture inside of the letter form, and then it was turned upside down, and it was all kinds of crazy because they wanted to see what they could do. Now, the same thing happened with the digital revolution. They wanted to see what they could do with type and see how far they could push it. So they had a lot of typefaces coming out like these. So these are created, again, we're going to go back just a little bit to what we talked about, by Emigre Fonts. So these were created and extremely popular. That typeface in the middle there, Remedy, was extremely popular in the 90s. I believe that Taco Bell used it for almost all of their branding. And these weren't really used for a lot of things, but it really opened up the world to specific niche typography. So what that means is it's almost like a boutique kind of type, that it only works well for one certain thing, but it works really, really well for that certain thing. So because the digital revolution didn't need a lot of overhead for printing type sorts, for keeping things in order, they could create these kind of generic novelty fonts for people to use however they like. So in the next person we're going to talk about is a designer by the name of Matthew Carter. He started working in the 50s, 1950 to early 1957, and he learned to cut his own metal type in the Netherlands. Now, he's one of the most important designers of the modern time, especially when it comes to type, and his work is used daily by millions and millions of people. In 1960, he visited New York, and he was incredibly inspired with what was happening there with design at the time. He came back into the Netherlands and started to create typefaces. So these typefaces started to become digitized during this time. He created typefaces like Gilliard, Mantina, Sophia, and even Big Castellan. Carter is also notable for designing a very, very interesting typeface, type family, type set for the Walker Art Center. What's notable about this is he did something very, very interesting. Is he created a sturdy sans serif set of capitals that you see there at the top. And he created this sturdy sans serif capitals, but then allowed for a snap-on serif to be added. What's interesting about that is it really creates a font that bridges all styles of typography. It was a sans serif, it was also a slab serif, but then it was also a serif at times. You could snap on different kinds of serifs depending on how you wanted it to look. You can make it look modernist, like as you see in the middle, 5 and 6 is kind of reminiscent of Bedini. You could make it strong as you look at 3 and 4, that's Rockwell, or it looks like what was happening with the New Haven Railroad. Or you can take it over to 9 and 0 and see that it's working in that traditional Roman kind of serif. Carter said this. He said, I think of this Walker typeface like window mannequins. It's a good bone structure that I can hang a lot of different clothing on. So he created very, very solid letter forms that he could then snap on or attach these kind of serifs to. In 2004, Carter also created a typeface specifically for Yale University. And that's notable because Yale University had the first graphic design program like we talked about. And this new typeface really paid homage to the deeply rooted love for typography that was a key part to the design program at Yale. And this is the this is the typeface that he came up with. Now, this typeface was used from everything from signage and really is paying homage back to that traditional Roman sans serif. It's not the modern serif. It's something that's very, very classic, very, very refined, and really created a new look for the design program at Yale. The next person you may have heard of, he's been in some hot water lately, Jonathan Hoffler. So Jonathan Hoffler worked exclusively almost with typeface design. He's done typeface for Rolling Stone, Harper's Bazaar, New York Times, Sports Illustrated, Esquire, all kinds of huge, huge names. And in 1989, he began the Hoffler Type Foundry. In 1996, he started working at Yale University teaching type, where he continues to teach even to this day. So he was a creator of a typeface by the name of Gotham. Gotham is really heralded as one of the cleanest fonts of our time. It's almost the Helvetica of the new millennium. And he created Gotham in 1989 and it started to become extremely popular in the 90s and has really caught on at the turn of the millennium. The next person we're going to talk about is Pat Gorman. Pat Gorman was working at Music Television, MTV. What's interesting about the digital revolution is that the photograph started to lose its status as kind of the undisputed documentation of visual reality. The photograph was really the way to do things before to capture a moment. Now we had television. And this allowed for kind of seamless images to be shown over and over and over to the mass audience. So because of this, electronic software was developed and created so that they could create seamless and really undetectable image manipulations. This is kind of the beginning of motion graphics. The boundaries started to become blurred between photography and illustration and fine art. It all started to kind of fall under this idea of design. But the first image manipulations programs were extremely expensive. Now this is a great story. So Pat Gorman created an MTV press cover kit for kind of to be used for internal use, to be used for what was happening in the press, to give out to the press to say, here's what's happening with MTV. Almost like an annual report. And he wanted to do something different. He wanted to exploit digital technology. So what he did is he went into the studio and he started to work on a string of electronic montages that he created. And this is the cover of the magazine. So he went in and started messing with the calibration on the monitors. He would move this button, move that button, change the frequency, break this recorder, and just with that MTV logo. And again, MTV is extremely, extremely, extremely influential at this time, especially when it comes to motion graphics. So he started to do all these things and started to kind of break the system, and they actually made all the other people in the room leave because they didn't want them to get any ideas that they could just change and do whatever they want. But Pat Gorman created this by exploiting digital technology. They didn't have the expensive digital manipulation software that people were using, but he did have things that he could change the look on the monitors, change the color calibration, change the frequency to really create these dynamic images. Again, we've talked about MTV, that the MTV logo isn't about the MTV logo. The MTV logo is about the texture that's used in it, about the context of that MTV logo. So this look was absolutely perfect for that MTV press kit. The next group that we're going to talk about started working in 1996, and they go by the name of Imaginary Forces. They are made up of Kyle Cooper, Chip Houghton, and Peter Frankfurt. And Imaginary Forces really is the predecessor to Saul Bass. Not necessarily in style, but in the idea of becoming the kings of the movie title sequence. They rapidly became the best film title design company by integrating graphic design, motion, and interactive media. They were known and quoted as being kind of reviewed as making title sequences that were worthy of the late Saul Bass. Which is an extreme compliment, as we talked about. Saul Bass is kind of the king of the movie title sequence. So Cooper from Imaginary Forces said this: "Everything starts with words. I read the script, and if the script is based on a novel, then I'll read the novel. And then I make the main titles. I want the main titles to tap into someone's obsession." So his goal is to find that one small thing and really exploit it, much like Saul Bass did. That he'd take a centralized image and really make that the key piece of art within the work that he was working on. Let's look at some of the notable work from Imaginary Forces. If you've seen the movie Seven, they did the opening credits to the movie Seven, the opening credits to the movie Spider-Man. You'll see it has this very dynamic visualization. Here you can actually see the direct correlation. The direct correlation between what was happening with Saul Bass's Man with the Golden Arm and what's happening here with Imaginary Forces Spider-Man. Some more work from Spider-Man. And the most Saul Bass introduction of pretty much anything happening right now is the opening to Mad Men. They went back into that time period and really thought, what would Saul Bass do with this? How can we make this title sequence absolutely beautiful? And that final title card is so much in the Beggar Staff's kind of Saul Bass style of having that collage paper cut of a very simple image with simple type. Next, we're going to start talking about a design studio by the name of Pentagram. So Pentagram is a design group that focuses on software prototypes, working on websites, interactive displays, and really extensive and huge media installations. One of the leading designers at Pentagram is Paula Scher. She's really been at the head and forefront of design for over 40 years. And her typography has recently started taking to the streets and building faces. She thought, why should type stay on a page when it could be on the side of a building, when it could be in an interesting orientation to bring type into the real world? Her type treatments are extremely sought after, and she's extremely, extremely popular. So let's take a look at some of her work. As you can see, she works with type in the real world setting. How will this type interact in this scene? You can see that her type goes from the ground to the floor to the ceiling, that it all kind of continues on these interesting planes, interesting works, and really makes things that are different and kind of question what things should be. This is a great piece. This is the exterior of the Lucent Technology Center for Art Education in New Jersey. that she created this huge typepiece that goes all over the building to kind of pick out these key words that are interesting of the time. The use of text to create kind of a visual form has been used forever, but it started to become referred to as pattern poetry during this time. A lot of word images and shapes that were explored by Dadaist, Cubists, Futurists, now are coming back. So if we look at this, it's almost a Dada style or a Words and Freedom futurist style, but it just happens to be on the side of a building instead of on a page. Artists started to see that they needed to free type from the digital realm. They needed to free type from the computer. So they started working in this real world setting of what they could do with it in the real world. Something else that's notable about Paula Scher is she created this branding for the Cleveland Public Theater. What's notable about this is that it doesn't have a logo. There's no logo here. She created a visual language using type that if you saw something in this style, you would know that it was specifically for this theater, specifically for this show. There was never anything that was the identifying logo or branding. The branding was that the type had a visual style and a voice all of its own. Next, we're going to talk about Beirut and Schmidt. So it's clear from their work that they kept the international typographic style alive and thriving. Even though a lot of people were revolting against the international typographic style during this time, these two really kept it alive and kept it going. They became partners at Pentagram in the 1990s, and their work really reflects the teaching of the international typographic style, but they would add a lot of their own modern refinements and kind of embellishments. If you look at some of their work, you can see that it's international typographic style, flush left, a jagged right edge, black and white, very clean, very readable, but then they're adding all of these swashes and swirls to really bring it into a new kind of zone. Here you'll see something that's much, much, much more traditionally international typographic style, black and white, jagged right edge, the type working on both a vertical and horizontal realm, really paying attention to being clear, precise, and clearly communicate, and even to the point to where they're working on a grid, which was extremely popular in that international typographic style. We're going to talk about a kind of one-off of what's happening around the world. So the design in the Netherlands kind of started to take a different turn than the rest of the world. For some reason, they have been on the cutting edge of design for the last 20 years or so. They started to work with experimental typography and really created a look all of their own. Now, when I say a look all their own, I mean that the Netherlands have kind of fostered a design culture that is so rich and so diverse that it's impossible to pinpoint a specific designer or a specific style to kind of pick out the style of the Netherlands. Designers are working, and it's a very open forum. This here is a piece by a designer, a design studio, that is influenced a lot by global cultures. They're influenced and work using kind of interpreted Islamic manuscripts with patterns with a modern twist. So when we look back at illuminated manuscripts, you could see that they would work in that Islamic style. So it would be extremely detailed, bright colors, and that's still alive and well, but brought into the digital age, into a new way of designing and new way of creating. So in the midst of this technological revolution, designers started to use century-old techniques and processes to really preserve the art of letterpress making. So there's kind of a letterpress revival, which we are very much going through right now still. Alan Kitching is a teacher and specialist in this area of letterpress and typographic design, printmaking. He's known for his use of wood type and metal type to really adapt the typography from the past and turn it into a means of modern communication. Here's some of his work. You can see here that he is kind of channeling the Words in Freedom futurist style, but doing it in a letterpress way. So that he has those giant metal blocks that he was using to print the word Hamlet, using that kind of ink gradient from red to blue to dark. But then you see that the type is arranged in an offset of the letters. That if you put the type together, you can see that it's arranged so that the top chunk is an H, the middle chunk is an A that's been disjointed, there's the L, the E, and the T. So he would work very much in the style to preserve what had been happening. Some more of his work, again, kind of paying homage back to that woodblock printing. You can see the texture of the wood. You can see that there's a person behind it and that it's been pressed with that ink to create this very, very cool look that is extremely popular and really going through another revival right now in design. Lastly, we're going to talk about hammer press. So hammer press was founded in 1994 with just one printing press and one cabinet of type. They very much were working in this same kind of letterpress revival. It was founded by a man by the name of Brady Vest. And hammer press not only uses type and block printing, but has also found art and illustration to incorporate into that and creates kind of many layers of vivid inks and overlapping letters and ornaments, working in different styles to create a new look that is modern, but somehow still going back to the roots of letterpress and printmaking, like this here poster for Explosions in the Sky, used from old wood type. You can see that it has the texture, it has the feeling, but yet it still feels modern and new. So that's where we end class, moving into this letterpress revival, which we are very much still in today. And I hope that you enjoyed the class. Thanks for watching.